Okay. Okay, let me just check it's recording before we start. Okay, it's recording, fantastic. Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another TESOL webinar. It's wonderful to have you here. It's 10 o'clock in the morning here, so good morning to the rest of you in the world who it's morning for, and good afternoon for those of you in Taipei. It's lovely to see so many people. I'm sure more people will be arriving as we get going. And just remind you all that if you want to comment or ask Ceri questions during the webinar, you can use the chat. But just check that you've got all panelists and attendees clicked just above where you type. There's a little blue menu that you can click, and you need to click all panelists and attendees just to make sure that everybody can see your question or your comment or whatever. Okay, and for those of you who are planning to come to the convention or would like to submit a proposal to give a talk at the convention in March in Oviedo, just to let you know that the call for papers is now open. So if you go to the TESOL-SPAIN webpage, you'll be able to find the call for papers there and you can submit a proposal. We'd love to have as many proposals as possible. So anybody who's got anything to say, please submit a proposal for a talk at the convention. And we'd love to see you all there as well. The convention will be the first weekend of March in Oviedo in the north of Spain next year. Okay, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ceri. I'll let Ceri introduce herself. I don't think she needs any introduction really, but I'll let her introduce herself. And Ceri's going to be talking to us about activities for the beginning bit and the end bit of the class today.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to put my PowerPoint presentation up, share my screen with you. So bear with me a second. Always takes a few seconds to come through. Okay. Can everyone see that? Can you type a yes in the chat box if you can see? Yes. Okay, great. There's a couple of people. I think you still need to select panelists and participants and attendees in your chat menu. Because I can see a couple of people at the moment are only sending messages to me and Amanda. Okay. And that way everyone will be able to see each other's messages. Okay, so as Amanda was saying, basically today we're going to be talking about lesson shapes, I guess, and I think generally speaking when we're talking about lesson planning, we tend to focus a lot on what I'd call the main course, the meat of the lesson, as it were, and obviously there's nothing wrong with that at all. We focus on outlining our objectives, assessing our outcomes, making a coherent unit, and of course all of this is as I was saying, like the meat of the lesson. But it's very easy to forget about the beginning and the end. And I think very often we're so busy looking at what we're going to be doing in the main body, but we don't remember that these parts of the lessons are also equally, if not sometimes, more important. So we're going to be looking at why they're important, but also what we can do to bolster the beginning and the end of our lessons. So first of all, why is the beginning so important? Why the end? Well, research shows that our memories tend to concentrate on the beginning and the end of anything, whether it's a book or a film or a lesson, and that we tend to remember more from the beginning and the end, and also that our lasting impression of anything will also be affected by a good strong beginning and a good strong end, and likewise negatively affected by something that just maybe peters out. And I think maybe that is one of our main faults, is possibly due to time management, that we don't always give ourselves enough time to do the closure of the lesson justice. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at. But we're also going to be looking at not only the beginning and the end, but and the lesson as a unit. We're also going to be looking at lessons as a series of events and of the course as a whole, so that the lesson isn't something that's a standalone, but that links backwards and forwards, and that the opening and closing of the lessons obviously are where it's easiest to build these bridges between one lesson and the next, and to help students see how we're moving step by step, progressing through the course. Okay, so we're going to start with the kicking off, the beginning of the lesson. Okay, so obviously we all have our favorite warmers, and one of the things that we want to do is we want to engage our students in the topic of our lesson, what our main course is going to be. But I'm going to suggest that there's also something that we might want to do before that, before we jump into the new lesson, as it were. I think there are lots of ways that we can use the first few minutes of the lesson to actually link back to what we've done before. So the first suggestion might be to share an image from your last class. It might be an image from the course book. It might be an image that comes from an activity that you may have been doing with your class. So I'll show you an example. Okay, so this was one of my photos that I shared with the class, and in the chat box, oh sorry, I need to go back. There. In the chat box, okay, no prizes for guessing. What was the topic of this lesson? Okay, I'm having problems seeing the chat box at the moment, Amanda, so maybe I'm afraid I can't see.
Ceri, there should be a menu either at the bottom of the screen or the top of the screen.
Hold on. Yeah.
And you should be able to find chat there. If not, click on the More button and you'll find it in there.
Well, okay, I've lost it for the moment. So I'll tell you about this lesson. Okay, so obviously this is a picture of some sand, and it was the sand from a local beach. And basically our lesson had been all about talking about the students' favorite beaches. It was coming up to summer, and we'd collected a lot of vocabulary around this image to describe going to the beach, their favorite beaches, why they like those beaches in particular.
Ceri,
and when
can I just interrupt just for a second? Your screen is not being shared at the moment. Do you want to reshare?
Right, sorry, yeah.
We can't see the slide. Thank you.
This is my fault for having gone looking for the chat. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Sharing the screen again. Okay, can everyone see that now? Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Right, and I have my chat back as well, so everything is sorted. So we've been talking about their favorite beaches, and when I showed the image to them, then immediately they could remember what we'd done, and they remembered a lot of the vocabulary from the lesson. And here is a slide from our whiteboard and some of the vocabulary that had come up the lesson before. So immediately that way they were just thrown back into the previous lesson, and it was very easy for us to just kick off with that link to the previous lesson. Okay, so sharing an image is one good way of kicking off. Another way of linking back to the last class could be to dictate a paragraph. In this case, I'm going to show you a paragraph which was something that we built up together during the previous lesson. We'd been talking about food, again, local food. Okay, and this was a paragraph that we'd actually built together during the lesson, a kind of a collaborative text, and this was our final text. And so at the beginning of the next lesson, I just simply did a dictogloss of this paragraph, reading it out and getting the students to just remember the key words, the new vocabulary that had come up, and then they quickly reformulated the paragraph in groups, and then that again kicked us off into the next lesson, but with this bridge from the lesson before. Okay, so sharing an image, possibly sharing a paragraph, which could be from a reading text that you'd worked on together. It could be something that the students had written. It could even be an exchange from a listening text. It could be a straight dictation. It could be a dictogloss. It could be a gapped dictation. Another idea, this is incredibly simple, but just to go back and revisit a comprehension exercise. This is something that I do quite a lot with lower level students, especially with listening, because I found quite a lot of my students are lacking in confidence, especially older adult students with the listening. And sometimes just revisiting again the exercise can help them to just feel, oh yes, okay, yes, that was okay. That was a positive experience I had with the listening last lesson. So just simply this, from the course book, they have the same gap fill that they completed in the lesson before whilst they were listening, and this time they do it as pair work. They just work together to remember the information as much as they can. And if you want to, if they want to, then why not listen one more time if this is going to boost their confidence. Obviously, if it's going to take too much time, no. All of these exercises are meant to just be quick, the first few minutes of the lesson, in order to help people to just get back into the swing of things. And again, as I say, to underline this link between what's gone before and what we're going to do next, and to really kind of emphasize this fact that the lessons are part of a bigger whole, and so that what they've done before is going to feed in to what they're going to do in the future. And it helps, the research psychologists suggest that it helps with motivation as well, but it helps with what Zoltan Dornier has labeled as directional motivation, so that the students feel that they're going somewhere, that everything that they do is adding up to their final goal. Okay. Another tool is to share a summary. Now, this is something that I've been doing more and more with my classes, is to write some form of lesson summary, that either the students themselves write it or I write it. It depends on the level of the class. So this is an example of a summary from an upper intermediate class. They had been doing very short presentations, and I wrote a quick summary of their presentations. They had a common problem, was dropping it, or maybe not having the it when it was necessary. So here you can see the its that I've had to add and the gaps where the it wasn't there. And so I was using the summary also to go back over a common error that we'd corrected in the lesson before. And very simply, that this is what they had to do with the summary, was to add in the its. And as you can see, this was kind of like a double aim lesson, sorry, double aim activity here, with the students focusing on what they'd done before. What I found with this particular summary was that they were really pleased that I'd gone to the effort of writing up their presentations. They hadn't expected that, and they kind of felt that their presentations were valued more from the fact that they'd actually been written up. And then this is something that I'd also asked them to do for homework, was to write up one of the presentations of one of the groups, not all of the groups, and then they were able to compare their homework summaries with mine. And this was a teenage group, so there were quite a few people who hadn't written summaries, but those who had kind of felt again that their homework had been validated, and those who hadn't, well, they had a summary of the work, and maybe some of them felt a little guilty for not having prepared for the lesson. So coming back to this idea of building bridges so that we can use the opening 4 or 5 minutes of a class to build a bridge with the previous class. One way is to keep a shared record of the lesson. So by this I mean to have a space somewhere where the short lesson summaries are being shared. What I found with my classes, the easiest was to create a classroom blog. So here's an example of a classroom blog. As you can see, there would be some ongoing posts, but also we would have these static pages which included the lesson summaries from across the course. With this particular class, we were working without a course book, and so this was all the more important because this was the record of the work we'd done. Rather than being able to flick back through their course book and see what we'd covered, we needed this as a kind of a backbone. But if you're using a course book as well, and I've used this as well with course book, the summaries are generally shorter, but still they include personalized touches, vocabulary maybe that came up during the lesson that isn't in the book, the kind of personal vocabulary that grows with the group throughout the course. And they have it in one place online where they can refer to it whenever they want. So here is an example of a lesson summary, and you can see with this particular class, which was an intermediate class from quite a few years ago, that I've used bold there just to highlight the language that we were working with particularly. Okay, with a little pointer there to the grammar that came up, too much, a lot, and this was it. This would have been the summary of one lesson. It really takes very little time to write up. And what I try to do with higher level classes is to train the students into producing these summaries and posting them on the blog. Flipping the classroom. This is obviously a way of building bridges not only between one lesson and the next, but also between what the students are doing outside the classroom and what they're doing in the classroom. So here we have a flipped duck, and even I think in a course which is not blended, which is let's say 100% face-to-face, elements of flipping can help. So for example, with a beginner group, we were struggling, or they were struggling in class with telling the time. So I sent them a link by email to watch a short YouTube tutorial on how to tell the time. And they were to look at that at home. And then the next class, I showed them that clip, mute, and they had to explain to me what the presentation was, and then we could just jump in straight into the practice with lots of short activities where they needed to ask each other questions about the time. And I found that it worked really well. I didn't use it for every lesson, but I used it every now and then with this particular beginners group, and it seemed to really give them confidence. It meant that they got talking immediately when they got into the classroom, and what I made sure was that these clips were always very short, so they were never watching anything that was longer than 3 minutes, and also helped a lot for us in class, because obviously, as we all know, one of the drawbacks of flipping the classroom is that not everybody is doing the homework, not everybody is preparing. So that moment at the beginning when we watch the video together again, mute, then the students are coming together to explain it, and those people who have missed it get to catch up as well. But in this way, we're building the bridge from what the students have been preparing themselves on their own outside the classroom with the next lesson. There are lots of, obviously, ways that we can use this and lots of examples. So let's quick summary then of what we've looked at so far for ways of using the opening section of the lesson. So from lesson to lesson, we can show an image, whether it's an image from the course book, an image that from a video that we've watched, a photo that we shared. Then generally, if we can project it, I think all the better. You can dictate a paragraph or a short exchange from a listening text, revisit a comprehension exercise or any other kind of exercise. But the comprehension exercise is that it's very controlled, very easy, very quick, and it just throws the students back into what they were doing in the lesson before. We can share summaries, and as I was saying, the summary can be something that the teacher writes or that the students write. Generally speaking, when I've used summaries with classes, I found that I've needed to write the summaries myself at the beginning, but then I've been able to hand that over to the students as the course progresses. And building bridges across the course. So here there were the two ideas. One is to keep a shared record somewhere. It could be a wiki, it could be a blog. Static pages are usually the best. And flipping the classroom from time to time can help the students feel that they're actually building the course themselves as well. So that they're, although we're the ones who are suggesting and preparing the clips that they're going to watch, although I must admit that I hardly ever prepare the clips myself because I think that is very time consuming. I prefer to find something that's already been made. But it gives the students an extra sense of ownership and responsibility in the actual building of the course. Okay, so we're going to move on from kicking off to the end of the lesson. So in between the kicking off, there's been a whole successful lesson going on, and then for the winding up, I think one of the possibly most difficult things for us is to remember to allow enough time to bring the lesson to a coherent, satisfactory end where we all feel like we've got somewhere, we've done something, and there's time to kind of sit back a moment, evaluate, actually bring out, make explicit what we've been doing, the language we've been focusing on, problems that have arisen, whatever, but to feel that we've all got to the end of a cycle together. So, ideas for winding up. In the class, and this is also a good way to actually produce a summary that you can use in the next lesson to pick up on, so is to write a summary of one of the activities. If it's a discussion, then it can be a report on the ideas that came up in the discussion. It could be a summary of a listening text or a reading text, but that the students actually have to create a short written text. This is a classic, obviously, to play a game, to review vocabulary, or new language from the lesson. So one of my favorites is bingo, where we have, for example, the new vocabulary items are scattered up on the board, and we have a small grid, usually 3 by 3. Students choose their 9 items to put into the grid, and then using definitions for these new pieces of language, then we play bingo very simply. If you have a vocabulary cards envelope or box, then obviously this is the time as well when we can bring that out and play with those vocabulary cards. There are so many quick review games that can be played with vocabulary. Hot seating is another favorite with my teenage classes. I don't know if you're all familiar with that. It's when you choose the item and one person, or usually I get them doing it in pairs, come to the front of the class with their backs to the board. The language goes up on the board, and then those 2 students ask questions of the class until they've guessed what the language is. So it's kind of like a vocabulary 20 questions. All of these kind of winding up games, but using the vocabulary that came out of the lesson, it makes us feel like we've got somewhere kind of a beat at the end of the lesson. Going back to the summaries, we can make the summaries competitive as well, so they don't have to be vocabulary games. But one of my favorites with the summaries is that first they write a summary with quite a generous word limit, and then with the same summary I ask them to cut it down, cut it down, cut it down. So we maybe have an initial word limit of 50, and then they work with that same summary and they cut it down to 30, and then they cut it down to 10, and then we see who can get the shortest possible summary, which still makes sense. Again, I found that this is one that teenagers like a lot, but the actual language processing that's going on with this activity is quite impressive. There's a lot of choices being made about how to say what you want to say, but with fewer words. Is actually very complex linguistic activity for them. So here we have some ideas that can be used also then recycled for kicking off in the next lesson. So the summaries, if you save the summaries, you can use those for kicking off in the next lesson. Okay, so obviously the end of the lesson is also a time for questions, and the questions go both ways. So if the students have got any questions about the lesson, then now is the time that they can ask them. Maybe they can ask each other first in pairs. Maybe they can prepare questions that they might want to ask you. These questions you could possibly set for the students for homework, depending on what kind of question they are. With some classes, I must admit that I'm not systematic with all classes with exit polls, but I like to have some kind of moment at the end of the lesson where we all assess how things went. So the exit poll can just very simply be scraps of paper, and the students just write down an activity they remember, or an activity they enjoyed, or some new language they learned, or again, going back to the questions, a question they'd like to ask. And the idea being to vary the focus of the exit poll with each lesson. So the exit poll basically being that the students take a minute to answer a question about the lesson, which helps them to quickly process the lesson in their mind, and then they hand these in to the teacher. And then we can go through these very quickly, and it gives us some instant feedback on the lesson and can feed into how we're going to plan the next lesson. So exit polls can, as I say, they can be on paper, they can be digital if you want. If you're working with mobile phones in the classroom, then students could send you their exit polls by mobile phone. I prefer to actually see the pieces of paper coming in because I can visually see that everybody's given me something. Other ways that we can get the students assessing, evaluating the lesson, their role in the lesson, what they've learned from the lesson, is to use engagement graphs. So My favorite one is kind of like the bottom right, possibly, where first of all, we quickly go through the stages of the lesson, what were the different activities or stages in the lesson, and then they map they map points on the map according to either interest, energy, difficulty. It depends, obviously, on the lesson, on the kind of activities, on what you want to focus on with that particular class in that particular moment. And then the students have to create a visual record of the lesson. I don't think it really matters what that visual record is. I think it's the process that matters. So that they're actually processing the experience of the lesson, and then they create something tangible. So they've got a visual outcome that they can then share with a partner or in a group, and they can interpret each other's graphs and just quickly talk about any high points or any low points in the lesson. And then obviously this can also feed into a whole class moment when again we talk about high points, low points, and again it's really useful for the teacher to be able to see which activities are successful, where the students maybe need more support, and again generally feeds into the next lessons and the shape of the course. So a quick summary of the winding up activities. Looking back over the lesson, we can have exit polls, engagement graphs, we can play with vocabulary cards, we can ask the students to write summaries. Again, if you're using lesson summaries with the class, or you're building some kind of a record of the work that's done during the course, then these summaries can feed into that as well. So they're very useful. They have, sort of another payoff, and feeding into this whole idea of lessons not being isolated, not being these little islands, and there's no contact between one and the other, so that building bridges between the lessons. We can maybe choose a student from the class to post a summary of the lesson. We can share links to flip the next lesson. And in this way, you can see that each lesson is something which is contributing to a whole. And so then in this way, ideally it would also, if you're in a context where students are coming to your classroom, particularly for the lesson, they're not already in school, it can help with students arriving late or students skipping classes, that they feel more part of a collaborative group who are working together to create a course together, and so that their participation in the lesson and in each lesson is important. Okay, so there we are, kicking off, winding up, bridging the gap. Here's a link to my blog, and I'm now going to activate my chat again, I think we may lose. Okay, here we go. I've got my chat, but I have lost my screen. Is that the same for everyone else?
Yeah, we can't see your slides, but we can see you, and we can see.
I'm really sorry. I don't know why. I don't seem to be able to juggle the
Don't worry.
the screen. So I really wanted to kind of make this a little bit more interactive. So now I'd like to open it up to any questions that anybody's got in the chat at all. And if you want, we can go through it bit by bit. I mean, maybe if there's anything anyone wants to ask about the whole idea of the importance of opening, or opening and closing, maybe we could start with that. Okay, Sophie, you're saying that you're going to use the summaries and the exit poll activities. Yeah, I think exit poll activities are really, really popular with a lot of teachers with all kinds of age groups. I know one teacher in Portugal, Anna Pires, who was the person who got me really enthusiastic about exit polls initially, who uses them with very young learners and really successfully. So I think it's something that is really worth playing around with. I end up with a lot of scraps of paper, but they are useful. Okay, an example of exit poll questions. So an example could be write 3 pieces of language that were new to you in this lesson, or write 3 pieces of language that you think you can use outside the class. So those would be kind of language-based questions. Other questions would be, very simply, which activity did you enjoy most today? Just that. So that can sometimes be just even a 1-word answer. That's a really quick exit poll. Or what did you find difficult today? What did you find easy? Another one could be, do you have any questions about today's lesson? And okay, I'm going to stop with the exit poll questions, and I have some more questions. Okay, so do you find that making a good starter encourages people to arrive on time more? Hi, Ronnie. Lovely to see that. Yes, I think it does. I think this idea of the kind of coming in dribs and drabs, 10 minutes late, 15 minutes late even, if they come in and they see that something's already happening and it seems to be a kind of quite an active, intense stage in the lesson which has already kicked off. So whether we're doing a dictogloss on a paragraph or the students are working in groups and actually producing something, I get that feeling that people kind of shuffle in a little bit more sheepishly and apologize more for being late, and that they tend to respect kind of the start time more because the lesson does actually start at the time that it should start, and we're not just chit-chatting, which is and small talk is so valuable. But if students perceive it as small talk, then maybe they kind of feel, oh, it's okay, the lesson doesn't start until 10 minutes in anyway. So I think it can help with that. How much time do they need to write summaries? Okay, obviously how much time depends on the level of the students. I tend to give 5 minutes, and it really emphasize this idea that the summaries need to be short. That this is a short summary. It's like 3 sentences max, or 2 sentences, or can you summarize the discussion in 1 sentence, so that it's not the meat of the content that's important, but the processing, as it were. Okay, Sophie, when do you start the wind down process? I would say 10 minutes before the end of the class, and that for me, that final stage of the lesson is actually an important part of my lesson plan, and that it will tie in with the activities from before. So it won't be something that's divorced from the lesson. It won't be, okay, now let's play hangman, which is definitely something that I would do and do sometimes, but then hopefully if we are playing hangman, then it's going to be vocabulary from the lesson. But it needs its time, it needs space, I think, and it's important. Okay, a possibility of electronically sending in learners quick feedback. So what platform would I use? Depends on the groups. With adult groups, they sometimes like to set up their own WhatsApp group, but that has to be something that comes from them. It's certainly not something that we can or should be placing on them, but there are lots of online tools that can be used. I'm a particular fan of Padlet, although recently they have limited the functions for the free online Padlet tool. So I think I'm maybe going to need to switch to Linoit. Let me write these in the chat. Padlet. People may remember Padlet as Wall Wisher from years ago. These two are great. Basically they're virtual post-its, and you don't need an account. They just need a link, and they can add a post-it. The lovely thing about these two is that you can then project the whole notice board, the virtual notice board with the post-its, to share it with the whole class. So they're actually really nice for homework activities as well. So the students have to answer a question on the Padlet or the Lineart or whatever virtual notice board, and then you can share that in class. Okay, so Lydia, you're asking, would you include error correction as part of the wind down? Would you need extra time for that plus summaries? Okay, so I think that for me, the error correction stage would come in at various stages during the lesson, depending on the activities, so that each activity would have some kind of brief feedback. I tend to kind of harvest those errors and put those on the board somewhere, so that at the end of the lesson on the board we do have a collection of common errors or language issues that came up in the lesson. So these certainly are part of this winding up. But I wouldn't be dedicating the winding up to the actual error correction. I think this is something I'd like to be part of the main body of the lesson. And that's something that students can reflect on in the end. Certainly the exit polls, it could be look at the errors, which is your most common error, or which one are you going to try and work on, or something like that. So definitely reflecting on any error correction work would be part of that ending. That plus there's a question there about the time, and you can't do everything. I mean, I would never do everything. These are all kind of, it's either a summary or a game or an exit poll, although I think the exit polls can also be combined with the others depending on what exactly you're asking them to do. The engagement graph, that takes a nice chunk of time as well. Nice. So it's like, again, 5 minutes or even more if you're going to do the engagement chart. So I certainly wouldn't be doing those every lesson either. It's very much a question of mix and match, variety, having ideas up your sleeve, actually deciding based on the dynamic of the class at the time, how the lesson's gone, any issues that came up during the lesson, anything that you think needs to be addressed particularly. For example, I'm thinking about my beginners at the moment who are really struggling with listening. So I would maybe want to use my last 5 minutes to boost confidence with that. So maybe something that was around writing a short summary of the conversation they listened to, or something along those lines, because it also feeds into this ongoing issue that we have with confidence with listening. Lovely. The Lydia, is suggesting using Kahoot. I'm guessing that most of you know about Kahoot. No, this is a wonderful quiz tool which students can answer the questions on their phone. Sorry if everybody knows that. I thought might need a gloss. And getting students to write the quizzes themselves, I think this is fantastic. They can do it in class, or they can do it for homework. If you're working with a group, for example, of teens in the same school together, then they're used to working in groups to do homework outside of class. I've had groups do that as well. They really enjoy Kahoot. There's something magical about Kahoot that just boosts the motivation. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Have I caught everybody's questions? I think the last question that I can see is the one on the Kahoots.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions from anyone, which it seems that everybody's asked to their heart's content, all their questions, well, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Ceri. I've learned lots, and I'm sure everybody who's been listening will agree. I've got some things that I'm going to take away and try out next week. If anybody has any last questions, do type them quickly in the chat now. And if not, I'd just like to say thank you all for participating, for all your questions, and for listening so attentively to Ceri. And thank you, Ceri, for such a wonderful webinar.
Thank you. I was just going to add then that on the blog, which I included a link to earlier, and Amanda put in the chat I saw, there are quite a few posts on using summaries and the ongoing record, as well as flipping. And these are from a couple of years ago, because I was really lucky to be given a couple of classes that I could experiment with and do whatever I wanted. So I got to kind of play around with these ideas quite a lot. So if you want to, I'm going to just write the address again. And sadly, my most recent classes I haven't had as much freedom with, so I've been blogging less. But if you go back a couple of years, you'll see that there are there's like a series on this particular topic of linking between lessons and how to get students into this whole idea of creating the course together.
Okay. So if anybody wants to have a look at Ceri's blog, I recommend it. I've looked at it lots of times for ideas. I'm stealing lots of ideas from today as well. Ceri, would you be able to send me the slides and we can upload them onto TESOL-SPAIN's webpage as well?
Absolutely. I'll do that as soon as as we finished. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So the recording of the webinar will also be available on the TESOL-SPAIN webpage for members. And if you're a member of TESOL-SPAIN, you can also download Ceri's slides from there. Okay, so thank you all very much once again, and thank you, Ceri, again.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Sorry about my chat glitch earlier.
It's not the worst problem we've had. Okay, I'd like to say goodbye and have a lovely rest of the day, if there's much of it left. If you're in Taipei, possibly not. And I hope the sun comes out where you are. It's definitely out here. And hope to see you in a webinar again for TESOL-SPAIN sometime soon. We're going to take a short break over the summer, but we'll be back in September with lots of wonderful people for you to tune into. So goodbye, everybody, and thank you for joining us today.